A priest stands in the courtyard of the ancient tabernacle. The air is thick with the intense heat of the bronze altar, or trying to get God's attention. To our modern minds, it feels like an obscure, ritualistic chore. We assume it is just another strange, ancient regulation. It is no longer a sheaf from the field. To understand what happens next, we have to look at an instruction that seems physically impossible to obey. The vast camp of Israel rests beneath the shadow of Mount Sinai. Millions of people are arranged in strict tribal formations, their tents spreading outward into the arid wilderness. At the center stands the tabernacle, the epicenter of God's dwelling. The system of sacrifices is established. The grain harvests are far in the future. But before the nation can march forward, the book of Numbers records a strange administrative command. In Numbers, chapter 8, God dictates the ordination of the Levites, the men chosen to assist the priests, dismantle the tabernacle, and carry the heavy, sacred furniture. Thousands of men are instructed to gather in the dusty courtyard before the sanctuary. The leaders of Israel step forward in the heat of the day. They press their hands heavily onto the heads of the Levites, identifying with them, transferring the burden of the nation's service onto this single tribe. And then, God gives Aaron an instruction that completely defies physics. The text commands Aaron to offer the Levites as a wave offering before the Lord. The Hebrew word used here is exactly the same, tenuphah. The problem is immediately obvious. Aaron is one man that had to be completed before the priests could finally sit down and eat. The familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. The tribe of Levi consists of approximately 22,000 males. Aaron cannot physically wrap his arms around thousands of human beings, lift them upward toward the heavens, and draw them back toward his chest. Even if he were to lift them one by one, the sheer physical weight of a grown man makes the traditional, heavy geometry of the ritual impossible. If the wave offering were merely a horizontal shake or a literal physical elevation of an object, the text of Numbers 8 would be absurd. But this impossible command proves exactly what the tenuphah actually is. It reveals the invisible legal reality beneath the physical action. The wave offering is not fundamentally about muscle and movement. It is a profound, binding mechanism of transfer. When Aaron performs this ritual, perhaps by gesturing broadly over the vast crowd, or by having the men step forward and backward in unison, he is executing a massive spiritual transaction. He is symbolically lifting an entire tribe out of the nation. The Levites are no longer considered part of the ordinary population. Like the breast of the ram and the sheaf of barley, they are crossing the boundary. They are yielding total ownership of their futures. They are being handed over entirely to the Lord. The English translation masks a much deeper mechanism. The wave offering was not a side-to-side shake. This is a dangerous threshold to cross. In the ancient world, to be given to a holy deity meant forfeiture. When you surrender something completely to the fire, it burns. When you surrender thousands of men to God's exclusive possession, they forfeit their ordinary lives. They lose their right to territorial inheritance. They will never own tribal farmland. Their independent wealth is gone. The tenuphah has claimed them. But remember, the strict rule of the wave offering. The geometry of the ritual is never a one-way path. When a priest elevates an offering, God does not keep it locked away in heaven. The tenuphah is not a mechanism of destruction. It is a mechanism of sanctified provision. The offering goes up in complete surrender, but it instantly comes down in grace. So what happens when the offering is not meat or grain, but thousands of living, breathing men? What happens to a human being once they are fully transferred into God's exclusive possession? The text reveals a hidden mechanism of exchange. That changes how we understand dedication. What does a holy God do with thousands of human lives that have been completely signed over to him? And it was certainly not a meaningless piece of temple choreography. The problem is not that the biblical verse is unclear. When an entire tribe of men is placed into the invisible hands of the tenuphah, what remains of their future? When Aaron performed the sweeping wave offering over the Levites in the wilderness, dust, the upward trajectory of the ritual was completed. God officially accepted the men as his exclusive property. He declares explicitly in Numbers chapter 8, "The Levites shall be mine." They were legally taken in place of all the firstborn children of Israel. The transfer of ownership was absolute. They had crossed the dangerous boundary from the common world into the sacred. But the strict geometry of the wave offering demands a second movement. The ritual is never complete at its highest point. There must be a downward motion. There must be a return. God does not pull the Levites away into the clouds. He does not consume them in the searing heat of the bronze altar. Instead, the very next verses reveal the stunning, life-giving symmetry of the ancient ritual. God speaks to Moses and says, "And I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and to his sons from among the people of Israel. To do the service for the people, the pattern remains perfectly intact." The heavy breast of the ram was surrendered, accepted by God. The problem is that we stop reading too early, and we fail to recognize what is actually happening in the priest's hands, and given back to sustain a single priestly family. The golden sheaf of barley was surrendered, accepted, and given back to unlock the agricultural survival of a nation. Now, an entire tribe of men is surrendered, accepted, and given back as a living, breathing gift to maintain the sanctuary and protect the congregation. This is the hidden mechanism of the wave offering. It completely rewrites our instinctive human understanding of surrender. We naturally fear that if we yield something entirely to God, our plans, our finances, our children, our safety, it will be lost to us forever. We assume that whatever crosses the boundary into God's possession is swallowed by the fire. We hold on tightly because we believe that surrender equals destruction. But the Tenufah teaches the exact opposite. Whatever is fully surrendered to God is not destroyed. It is rescued. It is removed from the fragile, unpredictable realm of human control. It is legally secured in the hands of the Creator, and then it is returned to the earth, permanently sanctified and repurposed for life. Dedication is not the end of a thing. It is the beginning of its true utility. For 1,500 years, this physical and legal exchange operated quietly in the background of Israel's history. The question is not just what physical motion he was making. The deeper question is why this specific movement was legally required. Millions of priestly portions were lifted at the altar. Thousands of spring harvests were unlocked by the elevation of the firstfruits. Generation after generation of Levites served their whole lives under the reality of the wave offering. But the ancient tabernacle system was only a shadow, preparing the world for a permanent reality. In the 1st century, the pattern reached its explosive, universe-altering fulfillment. To see the ultimate wave offering, we have to leave the wilderness and fast forward to the stone streets of Jerusalem. We have to look closely at the exact calendar day the elevated sheaf of barley was being offered by the high priest. The sun is just beginning to rise over the limestone walls of 1st century Jerusalem. It is a Sunday morning specifically, the morning after the Sabbath following Passover. Inside the massive courtyards of the Second Temple, the priests are preparing for a highly anticipated ritual. They are holding a freshly cut, golden sheaf of barley. This is the Feast of Firstfruits. In a few moments, the high priest will step forward. He will extend his arms, lift the omer of grain upward toward heaven, and draw it back toward his chest. He will perform the ancient Tenufah. By executing this precise physical geometry, he is asking God to accept this first portion so that the vast, waiting fields of Israel might be legally released for the harvest, to change the reality of the object he was holding. This is not ultimately a story about ancient temple rituals, but the priests in the courtyard do not realize that their physical ritual is suddenly obsolete. Because, at that exact moment, just outside the city walls, in the cool dawn air of a quiet garden, the true wave offering has already been elevated. A heavy stone door has been rolled away. A tomb is completely empty. Decades later, the Apostle Paul will look back at this precise morning and write a sentence that changes the architecture of the cosmos. In his first letter to the Corinthians, he writes, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Paul is not simply reaching for a poetic agricultural metaphor. He is acting as a brilliant biblical theologian, pointing directly back to the Tenepha in the book of Leviticus. Jesus of Nazareth is the ultimate wave offering. He is the first sheaf of the human harvest to conquer death. On the cross, he was lifted up from the earth, surrendered entirely to the Father, bearing the crushing weight of human sin, and crossing the ultimate boundary of mortality. He was yielded to the fire of divine justice. But the Father did not leave him in the ashes of the altar. The strict geometry of the wave offering demands a return. The Father accepted the perfect, sinless offering in the heavenly realm. And then, the downward motion of grace occurred. God returned him to the earth, resurrected, imperishable, and breathing. Jesus was presented to God, accepted in the highest sanctuary, and given back. It is a story about divine ownership, invisible boundaries, and the promise of resurrected life. The image of elevated hands holding an offering as the bread of life for the entire world. This is where the ancient legal mechanism becomes your absolute defense. Remember the rule of the feast, of firstfruits. When the priest elevated the single sheaf of barley, the acceptance of that one bundle legally guaranteed the acceptance of the entire field. The part secured the whole. Because the Father has fully, eternally accepted the resurrected Christ, every single person, united to him by faith, is legally, permanently accepted. The wrath is satisfied. The boundary is crossed. The harvest is secure. This Christological fulfillment is stunning. It connects the blood-stained courtyard of the wilderness tabernacle perfectly to the empty tomb in Jerusalem. The pattern is complete. But this historical reality leaves one final, intensely personal question. The story cannot remain safely locked in the ancient past. If Christ is the elevated firstfruits, what does that mean for the rest of the harvest? What does this ancient movement mean for your life today? If the resurrection of Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of the wave offering, the legal reality of the Tenepha now extends directly to you. The question is no longer about an ancient priest standing before an altar. The question is no longer about grain or sheep. The question is about what you are currently holding in your own hands. We all carry heavy things. We carry our children. Our careers is one of the most profound, yet frequently ignored, symbols in the biblical text. We miss its significance because the English word wave distracts us. Our deepest fears, our hidden grief, and our desperate plans for the future. The natural human instinct is to grip these things as tightly as possible. Your knuckles turn white trying to protect what you love. We instinctively believe that if we let go, everything will shatter. Deep down, many of us operate with the terrifying assumption that total surrender to God equals total loss. We still believe the ancient lie, that the altar only consumes. We are terrified that if we truly give our deepest desires or our worst anxieties over to God, He will take them away forever. Because of this, we live in a constant state of spiritual exhaustion. We are trying to protect our own harvests. We are trying to control what cannot be controlled. But the logic of the wave offering fundamentally changes your posture. It challenges the lie that yielding to God means destruction. When you bring your heaviest burden to God, you are not throwing it into a fire. You are performing the upward motion of the ancient ritual. You are lifting it out of the fragile, unpredictable realm of your own control, and you are transferring it into the invincible, eternal possession of the Father. You are making the deliberate, terrifying choice to say, "This belongs exclusively to you." What is the pressure in your life currently revealing? What are you clutching so tightly that your hands are exhausted? But if you trace this specific requirement carefully through the scriptures, it refuses to stay contained at the bronze altar. What have you mistaken for faith? When it is actually just a desperate attempt at control, the Tenepha gives you a concrete, scriptural mechanism for your fear. Recognize what you are holding. Name it honestly. Walk it to the altar. And elevate it. When you make that surrender, you must remember the strict, unbreakable geometry of the wave offering. The upward motion of surrender is never the end of the transaction. the downward motion of grace always follows. God does not demand your surrender simply to strip you of what you love. He requires the transfer so that the object, the person, the fear, or the plan can be legally sanctified. If the Father can be trusted to receive the crucified Son and return him as the resurrected King, he can be trusted with whatever you lift toward him today. This does not mean God is a vending machine who instantly hands back exactly what you gave him without any changes. When the Levites were yielded to God, they were returned with their lives radically restructured for service. When you yield a broken situation to God, he may return it to you with a completely different purpose. He may transform your grief into an instrument of his presence. He may completely reassign your future. But the absolute promise of the wave offering is this: whatever is placed into the hands of God is ultimately secure. The heavy smoke of burning acacia wood and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. He wears a tunic of white linen. It moves out of the tabernacle courtyard and into the springtime agricultural fields of Israel. It fundamentally changes the way the nation harvests their food. True safety is not found by keeping your life away from the altar. True safety is found by letting it cross the boundary. The physical gesture we began with in the dust of the ancient courtyard now carries the full weight of a transformed life. And to understand what this looks like when the ritual is complete, we must return to the sanctuary where it all began. Step back and look at the vast, intricate architecture of this single biblical command. What began as a misunderstood, seemingly primitive gesture in the dust of the wilderness has expanded into the very shape of the gospel. The wave offering was never merely an obscure rule for feeding priests. It was the physical shadow of the greatest spiritual reality in the universe. It is the rhythm of death and resurrection. From the heavy portion of the peace offering to the single golden sheaf of the spring harvest, to the thousands of Levites separated from the nation, and finally to the empty tomb in Jerusalem, the divine mechanism has remained perfectly consistent. God does not demand your offering in order to destroy it. He requires the transfer of ownership to secure it permanently in his grace. The part is given over so the whole can be saved. Eventually, the requirement escalates to a point that seems physically impossible, demanding that an entire tribe of thousands of human beings be waved before God. Think back to the physical scene where this entire journey began. A solitary figure stands in a sun-baked courtyard. The intense heat of the bronze altar presses heavily against his face. The air is thick with the smoke of the fire and the metallic scent of sacrifice. He extends his arms, gripping something precious, and lifts it up toward the open sky. For 1,500 years, that figure was a mortal Levitical priest, wearing white garments stained with the blood of an animal substitute. He lifted up temporary, perishable things, meat, grain, human servants, hoping that a holy God would accept the offering and give it back to sustain their fragile existence for one more day, one more season. But that ancient scene is no longer just a distant historical memory. The cinematic image of the lifted hands remains, but the identity of the priest has completely changed. You now have a high priest who did not offer the blood of rams or the barley of a temporal field. He offered himself. Jesus Christ stepped into the intense, unyielding heat of divine justice. He extended his arms upon the wood of the cross, yielding his breath, and became the ultimate, eternal tenufa. He was lifted up from the earth. And because the Father fully and eternally accepted his resurrected life in the heavenly places, and centuries later, this exact, overlooked ritual becomes the precise framework the New Testament uses to explain the morning of the resurrection. The entire human harvest attached to him is legally, permanently safe, which means the ancient geometry of the wave offering is now the fundamental daily rhythm of your own Christian life. When you face the terrifying prospect of letting go of your control, when you are asked to trust God with your shattered plans, your deep grief, your children, or your unknown future, you do not need to fear the altar. You are not throwing your life away into a consuming fire. You are extending your hands toward a Father who already proved his faithfulness on resurrection morning. You are participating in the exact same geometry of grace. Forward and upward in complete, unhindered surrender. Downward and backward in eternal, sanctified provision. True security is not found by gripping the fragile things of this world until your hands bleed. It is found by letting them cross the sacred boundary. The fire cannot consume what the Father has already accepted. Because the firstfruits have been elevated, the rest of your harvest is forever secure. When an Israelite brought a physical offering to the tabernacle, they were crossing a dangerous boundary. They were taking something from the ordinary, dusty world and handing it over to the holy creator of the universe. In the ancient mind, once something was given to a deity, it was entirely forfeited. It belonged exclusively to the altar. It belonged to the fire. But the wave offering interrupts that destruction. It is a carefully designed mechanism that halts the fire. To understand how a simple physical movement could legally alter the universe, we first have to understand the fundamental problem of how an ancient priest was supposed to survive. We have to look at what happens when something intensely holy needs to be handed back to an ordinary human being. In the ancient Near East, the logic of sacrifice was absolute. When a worshiper brought an animal to an altar, they were forfeiting their property entirely. The transaction was considered complete only when the offering was destroyed by fire. To give something to a deity meant you could never hold it again, the hem now deeply stained from the solemn work of the morning. In his hands, he holds the heavy breast of a freshly sacrificed ram. The fire consumed the holy, leaving nothing behind but ash and smoke. When God established the tabernacle in the wilderness, he instituted a system that utilized some of this ancient language but radically altered its purpose. The camp of Israel was divided by invisible, lethal boundaries, separating the holy from the common. At the center of the camp stood the bronze altar, a place of intense heat, blood, and gravity. It was the precise location where common things crossed over and became intensely holy. But this reality created a severe economic problem. The tribe of Levi, and specifically the priests descended from Aaron, were not given physical territory. They had no inheritance, no wheat fields to harvest, and no personal herds to sustain their families. God declared that he himself was their inheritance. So, how were the priests supposed to survive in a barren wilderness? If every sacrifice brought to the tabernacle was completely incinerated to satisfy the holiness of God, the men serving at the altar would starve. The book of Leviticus provides the solution, particularly in the instructions for the peace offering. The peace offering was a sacrifice meant to signify restored fellowship between God and man. When an Israelite brought an animal for this purpose, it was not entirely burned. The internal fat and the vital organs were placed on the fire, ascending to God, but the heavy breast of the animal was reserved. Normally, this is the moment of finality. The fire is waiting. The sacrifice is meant to be entirely consumed. It was specifically designated to feed the priest and his family. However, an ordinary man could not simply cut off a piece of holy meat from a sacred altar and carry it home. That would be an act of spiritual theft. It would be a fatal violation of sacred space. The meat belonged to the Lord, brought by the worshiper to his house. A human being, even a consecrated priest, could not take what belonged to God without consequence. Before the priest could eat his portion, the meat had to legally cross the boundary into God's exclusive possession, and then cross back out into the hands of the priest. This is where the wave offering enters the story. The wave offering was the exact point of transfer. It was not a meaningless physical flourish. It was the legal mechanism of exchange. It was the moment a sacrifice stopped being destined for destruction and became divine provision. By performing this specific motion, the priest acknowledged that the offering belonged entirely to God. He was yielding total ownership. But in the very same motion, God received the offering and instantly reassigned it. He gave it back. The holy was made safe for human sustenance. The priest did not take his dinner from the worshiper. He received his dinner directly from the hand of God. The wave offering was the physical manifestation of grace within a strict system of blood and fire, turning into smoke that rises into the desert sky. But instead of throwing the meat onto the searing bronze grate, yet the question remains, how did the priest actually perform this transfer? How did a physical motion legally change the status of the meat, if it was not a horizontal shake? What was the priest doing with his hands? The answer is hidden inside a specific Hebrew word, one that changes the entire geometry of the ritual. To see the actual motion taking place in the dust of the courtyard, we have to look past the English translation and examine the original language. The word our English Bibles translate as wave offering is the Hebrew noun tenufah. It is derived from the root verb nuf. The English translation is accurate in conveying physical movement, but it paints a flat, horizontal picture in our minds. It makes us think of a casual, erratic motion, like waving a flag in the wind or waving a hand in greeting. But the original term carries an additional, solemn sense of presentation and elevation. Scholars continue to debate the precise trajectory of the hands in ancient Israel, but early Jewish tradition and the architectural context of the sanctuary describe a very specific, three-dimensional geometry. The tenufah was not a meaningless side-to-side shake. It was a deliberate, physical enactment of surrender and reception. The priest does something unusual. He steps back from the heat. He extends his arms, gripping the offering tightly. Standing before the intense heat of the bronze altar, the priest would take the heavy, blood-stained breast of the ram. The physical weight of the meat required strength. He would extend his arms forward, moving the offering toward the altar, toward the presence of God, and lift it upward into the air. By elevating the sacrifice, he was removing it from the earthly realm. He was physically demonstrating a legal transfer of property. The forward and upward motion made a silent declaration. This belongs exclusively to the Lord. But the ritual did not stop at its highest point. After the offering was elevated and presented to God, the priest would bring it back down and draw it toward his own chest. Forward and upward in surrender, downward and backward in provision. The tenufah is an enacted theology. It visually answers the economic problem of the tabernacle. How does a holy God feed a human priest? He requires the priest to hand the food over completely, only to immediately return it as a sanctified gift. God does not demand the offering in order to consume it. He demands the offering in order to sanctify it. He receives the lifted offering into his heavenly possession, and then he hands it right back to sustain the life of his servant. Once you see this geometry, the strangeness of the ritual disappears. It becomes a beautiful, physical mechanism of trust, and he begins a specific, highly deliberate motion. If you read the standard English translation of Leviticus, this action is known as the wave offering. The priest's survival depended entirely on what was lifted up and returned. This vertical motion perfectly solves the immediate puzzle at the bronze altar. A strong man can easily extend and elevate a cut of meat. He can lift a basket of unleavened bread. That would already be significant. But the biblical pattern does not allow this ritual to remain quietly beside the fire. It moves from the priesthood out into the vast, open spaces of the nation. This vertical motion solves the immediate problem of feeding the priests, but it creates a massive logistical problem later in the Torah. Lifting a loaf of bread or a cut of meat makes sense. It is a heavy burden, but a human being can carry it. But what happens when the object being lifted weighs thousands of pounds? The wind sweeps across the terraced hills of ancient Israel. It is springtime, and the barley fields have turned golden, the stalks heavy with grain, bending under their own weight. After a long, lean winter of eating dry, stored rations, the nation is hungry. Men stand at the edges of their family plots with sharp iron sickles in their hands. The harvest is finally ready. The scent of fresh grain is in the air. But no one swings a blade. No one crushes the grain. For most modern readers, that phrase creates a slightly confusing, if not comical, mental image. We instinctively picture a man standing in the dust. No one lights an oven to bake fresh bread. Leviticus 23 commands a strict national pause. The boundary between the holy and the common extends even to the dirt and the crops. Before a single Israelite can consume the new spring harvest, a precise legal sequence must be completed. Someone must walk into the standing grain, cut the very first sheaf of barley, and carry it away from the farm. This single bundle, an omer of grain, must be brought to the sanctuary and placed directly into the hands of the priest. This event is commanded to take place on a very specific date. It must happen on the Feast of Firstfruits, which falls exactly on the day after the Sabbath following Passover. A Sunday morning, the camera moves back into the sanctuary courtyard, but this time, there is no heavy meat or blood in the priest's hands. He is holding a golden bundle of raw, uncut grain, and he performs the exact same geometry. He extends his arms forward toward the presence of God. He lifts the sheaf of barley upward into the air. He performs the tenufah. Most readers assume this is merely an ancient tax, giving the Creator his required percentage of the produce before humans take their share. But the meaning is far more profound. This single, elevated sheaf represents the thousands of acres of grain standing silently across the entire nation, awkwardly shaking a cut of meat or a loaf of bread horizontally from side to side. It sounds like a primitive gesture, someone waving a flag. By lifting this one bundle upward, yielding it entirely to God's possession, a massive legal transaction occurs in the heavenly realm. When God accepts the elevated first portion, He automatically accepts the entire vast harvest attached to it. The part guarantees the whole. The moment the priest brings the sheaf back down, receiving it back from God's domain, the invisible restriction lifts from the fields. The harvest is legally sanctified. The nation can finally swing their sickles and eat. Their survival for the next year is secured not by their own agricultural labor, but by the successful elevation and return of the firstfruits. We now see the tenufah expanding. It is no longer just a mechanism to feed a single priest beside an altar. It is the legal mechanism that sanctifies an entire nation's existence. The pattern is clear, and the physical requirements are obvious. Whether it is the breast of a sacrifice or a bundle of barley, the object must be light enough for a man to hold. It must be physically lifted up toward heaven. If the rule remains strictly physical, the system holds together perfectly. But as the Israelites prepare to march further into the wilderness in the book of Numbers, the pattern encounters a severe problem. The command is given again, but the object required for the wave offering is no longer a sheep from the flock.